So we build this roundtable as toxics. What do we know and what should we do about it? You know, what are the risks to human health and what is the latest science? And so we have assembled an amazing lineup here. I'm so excited to have all of you here today. Thank you. So let me do a quick introduction, then we're going to give presentations, and then we'll have a few minutes left for questions. So first up, we've got Dianne Barton, who's the chair of the National Tribal Toxics Council, an EPA advisory group advocating for tribal interests and policy decisions on toxics. She's also the water quality coordinator for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, where she provides technical expertise related to water quality, environmental toxins, regulatory processes, and fate and transport of contaminants. And Dianne earned her PhD in geochemistry at the University of Arizona in Houston. And I have to say that one of the missing links in these kinds of conferences is that we don't always bring in the scientific academic community. And so today we're really lucky to have Elise Granek, who is a professor at Portland State University. And Elise teaches in environmental science. She's a professor of environmental science at Portland State. She earned her PhD at Oregon State in marine ecology and advanced degree in forest science and conservation from Yale Environmental Studies and studied environmental studies at Penn. And then we've got David Farrar. Do I say that right? Farrar? Yeah, it's one way or the other. He's a public health toxicologist at the Oregon Health Authority. He received his doctorate in toxicology from the University of Rochester and was a postdoctoral fellow at Oregon State University. Oregon State University is a theme that has woven throughout the environmental world for as long as I've been doing this, for 40 years. So there is definitely some common threads at Oregon State. David joined Oregon Health Authority, where he develops guidance, policy, legislative testimony, and public communications on a wide range of environmental toxins and exposure pathways. He's participated in the establishment of health-based guidelines, values for environmental toxicants in recreational drinking water, ambient air, and fish tissue. And then finally, we've got Kevin Masterson, who worked for DEQ for 27 years, and the last 16 years, who was the agency toxics coordinator. He was the one person that was handling toxics at the agency. And so he's currently working as a consultant at Stony Creek Consultant, where he works on pollution reduction plans, pollution prevention initiatives, and a lot of the work that we've heard about today has Kevin's fingerprints on it. So first up, we've got Dianne, and here's the remote. Okay, down is forward.
Down is forward. All right, thanks, Holly. I get the pleasure of introducing, or doing the first piece in this panel to talk about the regulation of toxics in the Clean Water Act. And I think about Representative Helms' comment this morning about the black dragon of inevitable doom that was heading toward us. And you might think of toxics possibly as an invisible dragon. So many people mention PFAS throughout the day that you probably know that 95% of the population tests positive for having this compound in your bodies today. And so it's an invisible sort of threat to the general public who doesn't really realize that these toxics that are in our environment are affecting us all. Down? Oh, not down. Okay, there you go. So Kathleen this morning talked about the Clean Water Act, and we're celebrating the 50 years of this, and there's a couple of sections that directly address toxics, starting with the one that Kathleen talked about, Section 101, that sets the policy that says that the national policy is that the discharge of toxics in toxic amounts is prohibited. Section 307 formulated the toxics pollutant list, the toxics priority list, and then Section 311 lists, which was enacted in 1987, lists the regulation of hazardous substances. So the Clean Water Act, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the numbers, how many chemicals are regulated specifically under the Clean Water Act, and we look at the 65 pollutants and classes of pollutants that were on that toxic pollutant list from Section 307, 126 priority pollutants at 40 CFR 423. There are 59 industrial categories. These are not just individual toxins, but industrial categories that are regulated by the effluent limitation guidelines and standards, and 296 hazardous substances under Section 311. And then I also wanted to just quickly run through the Safe Drinking Water Act and the uncontaminated monitoring rule that started in 1996 to evaluate toxics in drinking water, and what the Clean Water Act was, or well, this is the Safe Drinking Water Act, was finding there. The fact that these toxics are being measured in drinking water ought to be a kind of a warning sign. Maybe that's the invisible dragon there, but the uncontaminated monitoring rule throughout the years from 2001, there's been 5 different series of these monitoring efforts, and the latest, of course, is looking at PFAS. So, what's the problem with this picture? The chemicals in commerce in general. There's a paper, and the links are going to be in the PowerPoint that you can look at. 350,000 chemicals and mixtures across countries and regions throughout the globe. These are not all toxic chemicals, these are chemicals. But a number of these are not regulated and are certainly not covered by the Clean Water Act. 60,000 chemicals were exempt from testing following the enactment of TSCA, Toxic Substances Control Act, in 1976. There are currently 40,000 chemicals that are active in the most recent evaluation of how many chemicals are there actually in commerce that were identified in 2019. Over 8,000 chemicals are on EPA's TSCA chemical data inventory reporting list. This means companies that are using these chemicals have to report their use to the EPA. These are limited by the size of the companies and the amount of chemicals that are being used. So this is not really a clear picture either. I failed to include on this list, there are 770 individual chemicals on the toxics release inventory list. So these are companies having to report what they're releasing into the environment. Another problem here, the Clean Water Act, as you saw, is only touching on the regulation of a few of these. Now, this morning everyone talked about, well, what's the problem here? Is these chemicals are in the environment, they're in the toxics release inventory, they're in the drinking water contamination monitoring program. So we're just not getting it right. The Clean Water Act certainly is not enough. And on the right-hand side, I just wanted to talk about the complexity of toxics. Their effects on human and aquatic health are very complex themselves. Sometimes there's mortality. 6-PPD results in the mortality of coho, but there's also chronic and sublethal endpoints on these same chemicals that are not even recognized. So not all the chemicals that we're talking about here are even showing mortality endpoints, but they still have impacts on the resources and the waters of the United States. Chemicals can bioaccumulate and become more concentrated as they move through the food web, and so the toxicity impacts here are at lower concentration levels than might be measured in the zebrafish. Looking at the 6-PPD example is a really good one because there were a lot of low-level subchronic effects seen in that high production volume chemical. That's an issue here. And then, this doesn't even talk about the issues of aggregate and cumulative exposures. What about populations that have pre-existing conditions or are exposed to more than one toxic that might have similar endpoints? So part of the complexity of the problem here. Then I want to specifically look at TSCA. As Holly mentioned, I am the chair of the National Tribal Toxics Council. We work with the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. And this is another kind of by the numbers, sort of give you an issue or a glimpse at what we face when we're looking at chemicals in commerce. TSCA was reauthorized in 2016, so this is kind of broken down into the top graph is before 2016 and the later graph is below that. But showing that between 1979 and 2016, for new chemicals in the market, this doesn't even include the 60,000 chemicals that were allowed into commerce without testing, 40,000 plus pre-manufactured notices. These were notices that go to EPA to get approval for use. And just to kind of give you a sense of the type, which ones of these are issues, or that might have issues, over 1,700 had different sort of consent orders before they were allowed into use. And if you go to the webpage on the bottom there, you can even get more statistics on how many were withdrawn and how many were completely disallowed, but it wasn't that many. And then since 2016, when TSCA was reauthorized, over 4,000 new chemical review requests, about 500 new chemicals a year is what we have to think about here. And the Clean Water Act, as I showed you on that earlier slide, is just kind of not covering it. So what do we do about this problem? There was a editorial that talked about what's going to fill the gap between the Clean Water Act and the reality of chemicals in commerce. This author on the left-hand side, and the link is down there too, said that the litigation is what's going to fill this gap. The Monsanto most recent settlement, and then well, on other PCBs throughout the country, you can look at that, a lot of litigation on this. Or I always like to draw your attention to TSCA and what is possible under this statute. But what I've included here on the right-hand side is an EPA response to questions on the risk evaluation. And this is EPA's position in August of 2020, where they see TSCA's function as a gap-filling statute. I couldn't disagree with this anymore, because it should not be gap-filling between statutes that are at work, and states and tribes that are trying to deal with these contaminants that are released into commerce. But EPA looks at TSCA as a gap-filling statute that should not be a gatekeeper. I see TSCA as the gatekeeper to keeping these chemicals that everybody talked about this morning in all the panels, and what we can possibly do about keeping these chemicals out of commerce. And then somebody talked about the cooperative federalism. Under 2016 TSCA, which was approved nearly unanimously by Congress, maybe that won't ever happen again, but what they did was they preempted state authority to regulate toxics themselves. So any contaminant that was reviewed at the federal level, states are going to be preempted from issuing their own sort of regulations and controls on those chemicals. So TSCA has some issues there, but I don't think the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act they can't possibly keep up with the number of chemicals that are being released and that have some toxicity endpoints. I think TSCA should be the primary means of regulating the production and use of industrial chemicals, and really should be the gatekeeper to controlling these chemicals and their impacts on the environment and public health. In addition, TSCA authority transcends environmental media. TSCA can evaluate impacts from air, water, soil, as well as disposal. Disposal is a condition of use under TSCA, and EPA ought to be using their authority to look at that aspect of release of those contaminants into the environment. And so TSCA has the authority to look at the complete life cycle. Also, under Section 6, risk evaluation, TSCA's new authority considers aggregate exposures. It says that in the law. I'm not saying that they've done that yet, but it's they should have that. One of the places to look for the solution that I found in preparing for this is the Association of Clean Water Act and Association of State Drinking Water Administration's recommendations for dealing with this problem. It kind of reminds me of Representative Helms' 2017 Integrated Water Plan. This plan is sitting on the shelf. It was finalized in 2019. Jennifer Weigel, who's no longer here, was part of the committee that worked on this for over a year. They came up with a framework that includes introductory screening, monitoring. They call on TSCA to handle these new chemicals, to handle formal risk assessments and risk management practices. Under these five, and Holly's gonna release that, but there's a link to it in these, up there on the slide. It also suggests expanding resources at both the state and federal level. It encourages that the federal system recognize state rules for controlling toxics, just the opposite of what TSCA has. It also encourages the engagement of industry. The chemical industry needs to be part of this discussion. And they, in fact, are on the 6PPD issue. Just wanted to point that out. So finally, you all might be wondering, well, what do tribes, why is this tribal group so integrated with TSCA? And this is where we've all talked about environmental justice communities. And under TSCA, there's a path for the environmental justice communities to be the community that protects your health. Because 18 times in the 2016 version of TSCA, it requires the EPA to consider potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations in their risk evaluations. Those populations should serve as the baseline for risk evaluation, not the general public, but the people that have the health impacts, that spend their entire lifetime in one single place. That's not how EPA looks at people, at places. They're oftentimes fence line communities. Those people are exposed the most to any toxic that is released into the environment, that consume natural resources and spend a great deal of their lifetime exposed to the environment. They are the people who are going to be exposed to contaminants that are released to the environment. Shouldn't they be the baseline for risk evaluations? We've advocated for this, that EPA consider this, and believe it or not, in one of the future risk evaluations they're gonna look at subsistence fish consumers for the risk evaluation of TBBPA. This is the first time. And hopefully that'll lead to some changes going forward. So that's all I'm gonna say.
I first want to thank Holly and Mary Lou for, thank you, for inviting me on this awesome panel. I'm really excited to speak with all of you and interact during the Q&A. And I'm also going to build on a lot of what was said earlier today. So I'm going to talk about, so I was invited, I think, to provide some background on the science, to sort of validate some of what Dianne was just bringing up. And so I'm going to talk about contaminants in waters and aquatic organisms, focusing mostly on Oregon. But I want to first give a huge shout out to my co-authors, so all of the awesome graduate students that have worked in my lab or with my lab to do the work that I'm going to talk about today. That one? Okay. And so I'm going to talk about a series of contaminants that have been mentioned today. And again, it was stated earlier, these groups of contaminants are referred to as emerging contaminants. I think they're emerging because we are just seeing that they're problematic, not because they are new to the environment. That's the reality. And so I'm going to be talking about pharmaceuticals and personal care products. I'll be talking about pesticides and herbicides, and I'll be talking about microplastics. I'm leaving out some really important ones like PFAS and 6-PPD, quinone, because my lab hasn't done any work on those, but I'm familiar with them, but not familiar enough that I'm going to present someone else's research on them. But I just want to give a shout out that they're also really important compounds that are in our waterways and in our organisms. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is personal pharmaceuticals and personal care products in coastal wastewater treatment plant effluent and effects on Pacific oysters. So one of my students, Amy Earhart, did research where she collected effluent from wastewater treatment plants at the coast in collaboration with those wastewater treatment plants. So that is the water that is going out back into the environment, into the estuary, right? So it was fully treated. We then diluted it to 25% mixed with ocean seawater that we make in lab and exposed oysters to that effluent water. And what we see, we saw a lot of different things. What I'm going to talk about today is the fact that we actually see of the approximately 50 compounds, pharmaceuticals and personal care products we looked for in that effluent water. So again, this is treated water. We still see about 13 of those compounds present in the effluent. So those 13 compounds were then, the organisms were exposed to them. They have moderate KOWs. That may not matter to some of you, but that's an indicator of how likely they are to bioaccumulate in tissue. And the bars are an indication of how much of that compound was in the wastewater treatment plant effluent from wastewater treatment plant 1 versus the gray is wastewater treatment plant 2. And the little squares are the concentrations in organisms after they were exposed for 90 days to a single dosing once a week of 25% effluent. So this is something that we would expect them to experience in the environment. We are not looking, those of you that have been in ecotoxicology a long time are maybe used to LC50, so looking at lethal concentrations. We are not interested in our lab in lethal concentrations. We're interested in what's going on in the environment. What are environmentally relevant concentrations doing to organisms? And what we saw was that there's uptake of these compounds in these organisms. And I just want to point out diphenhydramine, which is the active ingredient in Benadryl with the orange little triangle at the bottom. So that had really high uptake, even though it's KOW, our expectation of how much would bind in the tissue is much lower based on its KOW, but we still see it really accumulating in these organisms. And then we have other compounds like fluoxetine, which is the active ingredient in Prozac, which was in pretty low concentrations in the water, and yet it's still accumulating in the tissue. So to Diane's point of these, and some other people's point in the last session, that these things, it's concerning that these things are in our water after they're being treated. They're also being taken up by organisms that we eat and that are of tribal importance. So that's all for that one. We've also, so I'm going to move away from pharmaceuticals. We've also done work looking at linkages between forestry practices and estuarine bivalve, freshwater and estuarine bivalves in Oregon's Coast Range. So this is some work by Kagan Scully Engelmeyer that some of you at DEQ may know. And so he was looking at 3 species of freshwater mussels and 2 estuarine species, one of cultural importance and one of commercial importance. And he did biomonitoring and water sampling to look at pesticides and herbicides downstream of forestry use lands. And what we see, the big takeaways are that we see a series of compounds in the water. And so this speaks to this non-point source pollution question that was discussed this morning. There's a lot coming off our lands that are not being accounted for in our calculations. So in his sampling of organisms, we see 3 fungicides, 2 herbicides, and 7 insecticides. Those concentrations really vary across the landscape, and you can see that the Siuslaw is notorious in our data for having really high concentrations of these compounds in the tissue of organisms growing in those areas. This is also an area that tribal communities use to harvest resources. And it's worth noting that we detected some subset of these compounds in 39% of our samples. But that accumulation is really inconsistent across watersheds. What was my other point that I was just going to make? Oh, my other point is someone mentioned that we're often thinking about what are the effects of individual compounds, right? So that's for TSCA and for some of the EPA work. It's how are these compounds individually affecting organisms or individually affecting humans? Organisms and humans are not exposed to just single compounds in the environment. And this is a good demonstration of that. And similarly, his work in passive water sampling found some really important and high concentrations of hexazenone, atrazine, methyl sulfuron methyl, and sulfamethuron methyl. And so those compounds were detected at 80% of the sites we sampled, so 15 sites in the Coast Range of Oregon. And there was variation in the total herbicide concentration, but it was really well explained using statistical analyses and modeling by herbicide application notifications in ferns and in the State Forestry Registry notification system, and by the slope of the catchment. So we do know that forestry, or we do see indications that forestry is a source of these compounds into the waterways that then get taken up by organisms. Okay, so from that work, another graduate student, Ali Tissot, did research on experimental work in the lab, looking at how these compounds that Kagan had detected in the environment, how they affect the growth and fitness of clams. Again, we are not interested in lethal doses. So we are looking at concentrations where we expect we will have very little mortality in the lab. And in fact, in our control tank, I don't have a pointer. If you look at that little brown box on the far left, brownish red box, that's our control. We lost one individual in the whole 12-week study. One individual died on the very last day of the experiment. So in our lab, we have conditions that are good for the organisms. They're surviving, they're doing well. But you can see that although we didn't expect mortality, that y-axis is mortality. And in all of our treatments, except for one, we had really high mortality. This bottom graph gives you an indication of when things started to die. And again, these are the concentrations we used in this experiment are concentrations we actually had measured the year before in waterways in coastal Oregon. So we are not looking at concentrations that are crazy, sky high that we wouldn't expect to see in the environment. They're actually levels we see in the environment. And we see notable mortality in all of these treatments. So again, we looked at atrazine, hexazenone, what's my last one? Indaziflam, and bifenthrin, and combinations thereof. And so surprisingly, the hexazenone and indaziflam combination was the one that had the lowest mortality, and so we don't know if there's some sort of antagonistic effect between those two compounds. But every other combination or individual compound, we saw notably high mortality. And we see other effects. So in addition to mortality across all of the treatments, but that one treatment type, we see effects on clearance rates, so on feeding rates. So this has implications for the ecosystem services these bivalves are providing in terms of providing clear water that allows photosynthesis for plant life, or for macrophytes and that sort of thing. We see declines in condition index, so the overall condition of the organism. And we saw in one treatment changes in shell growth. But I also want to note that we also looked at uptake in this study. And so we looked at uptake of atrazine, indaziflam, and bifenthrin. And although atrazine and indaziflam, okay, I'm almost up, sorry, done, sorry. Although atrazine and indaziflam have similar KOWs, so KOW of 2.6 and 2.8, the indaziflam was taken up at a much higher rate in the organisms, and indaziflam is a new use herbicide that's considered much safer for aquatic organisms. And that was the uptake that we saw in the tissue. Oh, sorry. Okay, two more quick studies. So we've also looked at microplastics, and that's the bulk of the work that we are doing right now, although not exclusively. And so what we've looked at is the variety of microplastics and how they vary spatially and temporally in concentrations in Portland's freshwater ecosystems and in marine organisms. Really quickly, this is a map of Johnson Creek and the Clackamas River, and you can see the far left is sampling in August before the rains. The middle is September, right after the first rainfall, and the right is in February. This is 2020 and 2021. And the circles are an indication of how much microplastic we saw, and so you can see that there's a lot of variability across sites and by season. And there's also a lot of variability that's indicated by the main graph on the left, but on the top is an indication of different kinds of plastics that we see, because we talk about microplastic as one contaminant, but it's actually a whole class of different contaminants. And you can see that the colors indicate the group of contaminants. So for example, tire wear particles that have that, The quinone are in black, and you can see that we see very few of them in August before the rains, and then we see a big influx of those tire wear particles into the waterways in September when the rains start. So when we're sampling and when organisms are present in the body of water, it matters as well. We've also, this is my last piece of data, we've also looked at microparticles from Oregon's ocean to table. Oh, something's missing. There we go. And so we've looked in bivalves, in softshell, in razor clams and oysters, in lamprey, which are a culturally important species here in Oregon to many tribes, in herring as like a low food web fish, pink shrimp, commercially important, black rockfish, salmon, and lingcod. And guess which ones we see microplastics in? All of them. My last slide's missing. Okay. So I don't have the last slide, but basically we see concentrations of around 8 to 10 pieces of microplastic per oyster and razor clam. I think it's 10 per individual oyster and about 8 or 9 per razor clam. We see on the order of 7 to 12 per pink shrimp. Lamprey are also quite high, although I'm not remembering the number in the top of my head. Surprisingly, the Chinook salmon were the cleanest. We see microplastics in them, but the concentration per gram of tissue is actually lower than all of the others. But again, you can think about the potential implications on human health, the implications on food webs and ecosystems by exposure to these contaminants. And again, these organisms are being exposed to all of these classes, right? We saw in the same waterways, we see microplastics, we see pharmaceuticals and personal care products, and we see pesticides and herbicides. So I'll stop there. Woo.
All right. It's fun, it's exciting to be here. I think this is the first time before the pandemic, I spoke in public pretty often. This is the first time, I think, since the pandemic when it's not been like on a webinar or something. So this is really exciting. I'm glad to be with you. So I am with the Oregon Health Authority, and I think I'm the only one who has been from the Oregon Health Authority here. It's a big agency. It focuses on all areas of health. It includes like the Medicaid program and hospital, like the coordinated care organizations. It has a part to play in that. So direct care, like medical care. But it also houses the public health division, and that's where I am. It's also in the public health division is the Drinking Water Services Program, which administers the Safe Drinking Water Act in Oregon. So there is and people have mentioned that earlier in the day too. So we have a role to play there, and the little section that I'm in is small but mighty, and we do some technical consulting for that Drinking Water Services Program, but we also have a few water-related programs just within our little section. We have a domestic well safety program, a fish consumption advisory program, a harmful algae bloom advisory program, and in coordination with DEQ, we also participate in a beach water monitoring program. So a lot of different ways that our environmental public health section interacts with water. And also an important thing about being part of Oregon Health Authority is our focus on eliminating health inequities by 2030, which would mean that regardless of income or race or any identifying factor about a person, none of those things would result in inequitable health outcomes, which is an ambitious goal, and I'm proud to be part of an organization that's striving to meet it. And the environment that we're in plays a big part in our health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the health effects of some of the emerging contaminants that aren't really emerging. Maybe talk about it in the same way that Elise did for aquatic organisms, but for people, because that's our role in environmental public health. DEQ protects the environment from people, and we protect people from the environment. So there's like a million of these kinds of contaminants, right? So I can't do all of it. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The first one I'll mention is cyanotoxins. This is a really good example of an emerging contaminant that's not emerging, right? Cyanotoxins are produced by cyanobacteria, which are the oldest living thing on Earth. So they were here before, way, way before we were here. And they're not unprecedented, right? So that, I liked what Representative Holmes said too. They are precedented, right? They've been here for a very long time. And in fact, they were one of the first things on Earth that were doing photosynthesis, like creating oxygen using energy from the sun. And they were responsible for creating the oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed for oxygen-dependent life to form and exist on Earth. So we have a lot that we owe to cyanobacteria. People call these also, when these bacteria have good environmental conditions for them, they outcompete everything else and they dominate the water body. And when that happens, they form these, we call them blooms, right? And that's where that term harmful algae blooms comes from. They're from these cyanobacteria. There aren't actually algae, but they look like them because they do the photosynthesis and are green and stuff. But some species of these produce toxins, and the results of those, and those toxins cause harm to human health and the health of other animals too. There's a few classes of cyanotoxins. Some of them are liver toxins. Symptoms in humans are similar to like food poisoning. So we think that it's very underreported. We think there's a lot more people that are affected by this than we know about, because symptoms are so much like food poisoning, and people are exposed at the same time. Like you go to a water body and go water skiing, but you also eat a picnic and maybe have potato salad, right? So you don't know for sure whether it was this potato salad or cyanotoxins from swimming or water skiing in the lake. Some of the toxins are neurotoxins, and the symptoms of those are like tingling and numbness in fingers and extremities and limbs. If it's high enough, you can have headaches and loss of memory and balance. And then all of the cyanobacteria have a component of their cell wall that can be irritating to the skin for people who have sensitive skin. And that's the least serious of the effects. It's kind of just a self-limiting rash that goes away on its own. So we don't have any record of people dying from cyanotoxins in the United States, at least from recreational or drinking water exposures. But we do have a lot of records of dogs and livestock being killed by cyanotoxins, mainly because they get such a higher dose. Though dogs, these things taste good to cows, and dogs like them too, so they'll actually seek out the thickest part of the mat and drink it or eat it. So it's a big deal for our companion animals for sure. The conditions that lead to cyanobacteria thriving are related to climate change. So this is a good example of how climate change doesn't necessarily create a lot of problems, but it's a threat multiplier, right? So cyanobacteria were already here way, way before climate change was happening. But climate change creates conditions like warm water, still water, low water, more concentrated nutrients in the water that just cause them to explode and take over everything else. So this more frequent and intense blooms is new and growing because of threat due to climate change. Now all surface waters are vulnerable. So we've had blooms that are on high Cascade Mountain lakes that we're not sure where, like if there's a nutrient input, we're not sure what it is. But you can find these blooms happen everywhere. They happen in puddles, they happen in water troughs in agricultural operations. It doesn't take a lot of water to have a cyanobacterial bloom. Public water systems in Oregon are required that take their water from surface, are required to test throughout the bloom season for cyanotoxins. And if they find them, they're required to report that they found them and notify their consumers. In one population, one human population we're really concerned about are people who have private water intakes from surface water. And that happens more than you might think, especially around lakes on the coast. There's a lot of cabins and lake houses that just have like a pipe that sticks out into the lake. And that's the water source for the house. And maybe there's like a treatment system, but the type of treatment systems available for private at that scale are not effective at removing cyanobacteria. So that's a population we're concerned about. So another climate-related emerging contaminant that's also not emerging is benzene in public water systems. And this is something that has not been seen really much ever, except for recently as places have burned in big wildfires. So this was first documented in the big Camp Fire that was in California. It was a few years ago. That whole town was sort of demolished by this fire. And when public water system infrastructure is burned, that infuses benzene into the water. And that's a problem because benzene increases risk of leukemia and causes other blood disorders. So it's not so much that benzene is a new contaminant. We know a lot about the toxicology of benzene, but it's strange for it to be showing up in water. And that's happening more with wildfire, which is expected to grow in intensity and frequency and duration with climate change. Oh, I should also mention that wildfires also influence drinking water by increasing erosion. So when you have more erosion, you have more total dissolved organics, and that can cause more treatment-related byproducts. So usually that's just like a season or two after the fire, but that's another way that wildfires, a new way that contaminants are being put into water at higher frequencies. So the last these are two slides left. People have talked a lot about these poly and perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. We talk about them a lot at Oregon Health Authority with our drinking water program and in our section, Environmental Public Health. As people have said, they're a huge class of chemicals. There's more than 4,000 members of this chemical class. They're used in many things. They're both grease resistant and water resistant, which makes them really useful for stain resistance and non-stick surfaces like food packaging. They're also used in aqueous firefighting foams, especially and the places they get into the environment in Oregon tend to be around firefighting training facilities and airports and military bases where they're used for training exercises and to put out actual fires, but more training than actual fires. So that's where they come from. And the reason that we care about them is that some of them have some known health effects. So we know that they increase cholesterol levels at the right doses. They can change liver enzymes. They can cause small decreases in infant birth weights, and even a small change in birth weights can have a pretty important, there's trajectory implications for the baby, right? If babies there's a lot of data that if babies are born small for birth weight, there's like that sets them up for a whole lifetime of potential health problems. There's a decrease in vaccine responsiveness, increased risk of high blood pressure in pregnant women during pregnancy, and an increased risk of kidney or testicular cancer. There's other things that have been shown in animal studies also. These are all ones that have been shown in people. These are things that we know about a very small subset of PFAS. We have data like this for something like 7 PFAS species out of the 4,000 plus. So we are concerned about the other thousands that that they might have similar effects that we just don't know about yet because there hasn't been resources or capacity or time to study them all. Now, this is important. So the big news around PFAS right now, we're all waiting for EPA to release their release their proposed rule for drinking water standards for a couple of specific PFAS chemicals. And if things go the direction that people are thinking, they'll be very low. This decreased vaccine responsiveness has been shown to happen in children exposed, and the health advisory level that's been established is below the level of detection for PFOA and PFOS. So if, depending on how that lands and how much, and whether the EPA goes with that health endpoint as the basis for the number, it has big implications for drinking water systems all around the country, including here in Oregon. So, so maybe I'll leave it there, and maybe we can talk more during questions.
I was going to talk a little bit about how to look at these at a higher level, these emerging contaminants, and kind of summarize and frame the challenges and opportunities associated with these chemicals, because there's a lot of connections between them. But again, there are some opportunities I think that are pretty unique that we can pursue, and we've heard about some of them today from Dianne and other people going the wrong way. So in terms of what connects PFAS, phthalates, flame retardants, microplastics, these whole classes of chemicals that we are calling emerging contaminants, but aren't really emerging, they are really linked in a number of ways. First of all, they're everywhere. Before there were the forever chemicals for PFAS, phthalates were called the everywhere chemicals. And now we know that PFAS are forever and everywhere. So we are running out of monikers to put on some of these chemicals, but not only are they in massive number of consumer and business products, they're also entering the environment in a number of different ways. So through air deposition, through runoff, leaching, and direct discharge to the environment. So that's why you can measure rainwater and it has PFAS in it, or you can draw a core sample in the Antarctic and find PFAS and other chemicals like microplastics. So they are everywhere, and that is a unique challenge, along with the fact that there are so many of these chemicals within a certain class. Dave was mentioning 4,000 PFAS in commerce or breakdown products. Last I heard it was 9,000, then I read an article the other day that said it's now 12,000. I think tomorrow we'll wake up and it'll be like 14,000. But the bottom line is that there are many of these chemicals in a certain class, and they have common characteristics, but there's differences too. And many of them hang around in the environment quite a long time, although there's a lot of variations even within the same class in terms of persistence in the environment, but many of them are quite persistent. And then in terms of accumulation in biota, you heard a little bit about this. There hasn't been as much testing of fish and other aquatic organisms when it comes to these emerging contaminants as there is directly in the environment or in people. But the science shows that the chemical and physical characteristics of these chemicals would indicate that they would bioaccumulate and bioconcentrate in organisms. And you heard about, I think, a little bit before about the mobility of these chemicals in water. And if you look at some of the persistent organic chemicals that we're used to dealing with historically, like PCBs, DDT, and other organochlorine pesticides, they're very problematic. They stick around for decades, but they tend not to move very much. They attach to sediment and they drop down to the bottom of creeks and lakes. Well, in the case of PFAS and plastic nanoparticles, they travel far and wide. So not only are they persistent and toxic, they move in water readily. And then what makes them emerging, at least from my perspective, is that the regulations, not just the science, but the regulations haven't caught up with the number of chemicals in commerce, especially on the back end and the front end. So we talked about the fact that there's safe drinking water regulations in development for 2 or 3 PFAS chemicals. It's the same with the Clean Water Act. You'll be seeing some aquatic life criteria coming out of EPA for PFOA and PFOS. Again, that's 2 out of 9,000. So it will take decades to even prioritize and develop regulations and limits for even a fraction of the total number of those chemicals. Which means that there really need to be other tools in the toolbox to deal with these issues. And I think this echoes some of the comments that you heard earlier today. There really need to be alternative approaches. That the Clean Water Act really can't be the sole or even the primary tool to deal with these chemical constituents. And so the way I think about it is in sort of 3 boxes. The first being looking at chemical use restrictions or bans. And you heard Dianne talk about TSCA. And one of the challenges with TSCA, even though it was reformed in 2016, and there's a lot more authority that EPA has, there's still a limited amount of resources to get these things through the process. There's a lot of science, a lot of study that has to happen. So for PFAS right now, there are test orders that are coming out from EPA telling manufacturers they have to test these chemicals to find out more about them. There's reviewing of uses. So EPA needs to look at the uses and the appropriateness of the uses before you even get to the risk evaluation and the risk management actions that happen. I will also say that it takes, a long time to just get 20 to 40 of these chemicals through that entire process. And I think it's every year or every 2 years, EPA is mandated to take on around 10 of these chemicals. So you heard the numbers that Dianne threw out in terms of what's in commerce. So there's a lot of catch-up that's being made. I just heard the other day that trichloroethylene, which is something I was working with businesses on 30 years ago to try to get them to stop using trichloroethylene. It was really bad for workers, really bad for groundwater. They finally are taking risk management action and pretty much banning trichloroethylene. So it takes a long time. So even though there's more oomph in terms of authority right now, if you're only dealing with 20 of them a year and you're not going to ban them in a year, you're going to start the process, get the train moving down the tracks. So a lot more resources have to come into the system. I wanted to also highlight FIFRA, and you heard Gene mention that earlier. That's the pesticide law. And so when you talk about 80,000 chemicals in commerce under TSCA, those are the ones in business manufacturing processes, in products, consumer products that aren't pesticides. Pesticides are regulated on the front end a lot differently under FIFRA. And historically, there was a lot more teeth that EPA had under FIFRA to manage pesticides by requiring testing of biological organisms and making sure that there's enough data before they hit the marketplace. And so that's another 1,000 chemicals that are registered in the state of Oregon in active ingredients that are separate from TSCA. And even so, even though that there's a lot of testing that happens beforehand, EPA is under-resourced in terms of the work that needs to happen. And just last week, the Ninth Circuit Court has said that ruled that EPA did not look at Endangered Species Act rule requirements in approving a new insecticide that's now everywhere, and people are using it as the new shiny insecticide of choice. So a lot of work has to be done. So it's great they have to do that work, but it takes time and resources. The FDA is involved in looking at things like food packaging and cosmetics, personal care products. They say they're looking at PFAS in food packaging and may take action, but so far they have not. The Consumer Product Safety Commission is a very small agency, but they have a lot of teeth. And 10 years ago, they banned 8 phthalates, I think, in toys that children use. And then states are taking a lot of action. And I think you've seen this throughout the years as states are on the forefront of trying to address these problems. It can push the federal government to take action. It had happened with copper and brake pads. It could happen with 6-PBD. And right now with PFAS, there are 13 states that are taking action on consumer products, banning everything from fire foam, textiles, carpets, and rugs, ski wax in Vermont, and dental floss. And so there's a lot of state action on PFAS. The other thing that needs to happen besides regulating these chemicals on the front end is to generate more data to make decisions. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's hard for EPA to make decisions. It's hard for states to make decisions, and consumers and retailers and what they're buying if they don't have good data. And so requiring better product ingredient disclosure is very important. I've heard Nike and others say that they do a lot of work on restricting chemicals, but they don't even know sometimes what's being used to make their products. And by the time it comes from the original place that was manufactured to the final shoe that's being made, there's a lot that's lost in translation. And so the retailers can't even tell you sometimes what's in those products, and they don't have to disclose a lot of those ingredients if it's less than 1% of the total volume. That's what's on the MSDS sheet. And 1% is 10,000 parts per million, so that could have a lot of effects. So having better health product declarations, or having governments require it, having retailers, the Walmarts of the world, requiring disclosure, allows decisions to be made by the buyers, the big buyers, and consumers, because sometimes we just don't even know what's there. And then there's this whole concept of essentiality that's being talked about like a lot right now, PFAS especially, but other chemicals as well. Is the chemical function absolutely necessary? So with PFAS, there are some uses like manufacturing aircraft parts, like hoses, seals, control systems, that they haven't found viable alternatives yet. So those are critical. There's a whole host of other uses that are in the nice to have category, like having Scotchguard or stain resistance on your office chair. I know eating at my desk a lot, I spilled a lot of my lunch on my chair over the years, and it's nice that it cleans up fast, but is it really necessary? Same with your carpets. These are nice to have things, and so there's a big discussion about identifying the non-essential uses, because you can accelerate source reduction activities really fast. If you say, well, these can be phased out, you don't even need to find a substitute. You just need to find a material that can be easily cleaned up. So that is a real important point, but we also need to evaluate alternatives where we need an alternative. We really do need a substitute, and there are potentially viable ones, whether it's for antioxidants in tires, or something that we can use to glide our dental floss better. So there are needs out there to find out more about the substitute products. And you've heard all about regrettable substitutions over the years, and my career is littered with them. I even would go out to businesses and say, early in my career, you should try this brominated flame retardant. It works a lot better than the chlorinated compound. And then I would come back and say, no, don't do that. I just found out. Well, how was I to know that everybody said that it was not unregulated? If it was unregulated, that must mean it's fine, right? Well, none of the regulations have caught up with the manufacture of these chemicals. As Dianne said, they're already out on the market. They're presumed safe. And then 10 years down the line, it's the next PCB. So we need better data on the front end. And so there's a whole burgeoning effort right now to do more chemical alternatives assessments, and some of the laws that have passed to ban PFAS in food packaging. You have to do an alternatives assessment to make sure that you're not substituting something that's just as bad. And there's a big effort to try to set up an institute or a center of excellence to do that work. You also have to make sure it works. And then finally, expanding market drivers and incentives. There need to be more market signals and drivers to promote these safer alternatives and drive people away from the more toxic stuff. You heard about safer choice. EPA is getting a lot of money to boost safer choice. You can see that logo and know that this product has been vetted. It doesn't have the worst of the worst chemicals in it. And that sends a lot of signals to both the buyers and the sellers that, yeah, maybe we should get on board and have our product certified. A lot can be done with institutional purchasing. The state of Oregon has an executive order related to green chemistry that promotes low toxicity purchasing, and local governments can sign on to those price agreements and contracts. The retailers can do the same thing, saying they're only going to buy safer products. So that can move the market. And finally, green chemistry research is really critical for those situations where there aren't any viable alternatives. You need something that works, like to put in your tires, but there's nothing out there. We need the chemists to come up with some new priority chemicals that are safer. And so that requires private industry, government, and the research community working together. One of the things that can be done to accelerate that, obviously, is to put more emphasis on safer chemistry in chemistry programs around the country. And many of these programs at the universities don't even require a toxicology course to be taught, and you can get a PhD in chemistry. And that's the ultimate source reduction effort. Make green chemists. They're the ones that are making these things, right? Lastly, just to sum up, there we go. One more. Just food for thought going into the Q&A. Some of the possible policy and program actions for emerging contaminants at sort of a higher level, looking at different levels of government. These are some of the things that a lot of us have talked about that can be done. Again, at a little higher level, looking at the federal government to enact some of these source reduction policies and requirements rather than just back-end pollution control regulations, as we talked about, but also being on the forefront like the Office of Research and Development is now in producing timely scientific findings on effects, risks of these chemicals, and where the stuff ends up, fate and transport. So states and local governments are trying to figure that out on the back end, providing funding to state and local governments to help them implement new pollution rules. So now there's a whole host of PFAS rules coming down the pipe for the Clean Water Act. A lot of monitoring. It's very expensive, $500 a pop to take samples for PFAS. So where's that money going to come from? And developing innovative regulatory models. We talked about classes of chemicals and allowing some flexibility. One idea is to take the approach that Oregon did with mercury minimization plans. Having a set criteria wasn't really workable under the TMDL and the permitting program. So requiring these plans that really demonstrate action that minimizes the chemicals but allows for more flexibility, you can get a lot more done. The state government, you can develop action plans that cut across programs and agencies like Washington does with their chemical action plans for phthalates and so on, working to fill data gaps and working with, states can work with all their stakeholders and tribes and others, providing technical assistance to permit holders. And at the local government level is being on the ground floor where you can reach your constituents and do more public education and reducing the sources of those contaminants coming into wastewater systems, for instance, doing more institutional purchasing. There's a lot that the public works departments buy that has phthalates and PFAS in it, and reducing that demand. So those are just some ideas for different levels of government.
Awesome. Oh, excellent, excellent presentations. Okay, so in our remaining few minutes, we're going to have a little Q&A, and I have a long list here of questions that I have, but I'm going to see, I'll check in with you. But first, there was a lot of talk about possible data gaps, and I would really love to hear from all four of you. What are the biggest data gaps? What would you like to see studied? Where should we put this research money? And we have one microphone, so we have to kind of start and move on down.
So one of the things that I find that EPA needs in their risk evaluations is specific data. They're evaluating TBBPA, tetrabromo bisphenol A, and subsistence consumers. But what they need and will not do with less than is exact measurements of TBBPA in fish, a fish consumption number for the tribe eating that fish, and that exposure. And that does not exist, and they're going to move ahead without that data.
I think in addition to that point, one of the things that is really lacking is understanding multiple stressor effects, whether that's on human health or on organismal effects, or how these compounds interact in the environment. Again, in these waterways, we never see just one compound, and we never see just one class of compounds. But we don't really have a good understanding of how the interactions among these compounds, how multiple compounds interact with each other under different temperature conditions, under different pH conditions, et cetera.
Yeah, I would add to that. So we know some things about some PFAS chemicals, for example, but we don't know what it means when they're all together, and they are all together. so that's a big data gap. Another type of compounding factor that I think is missing in a lot of like human health toxicology is the effect that like psychosocial stress plays, and if you and this goes right to environmental justice, because if we know for lead, for example, that if a child is stressed, like has had traumatic events or is going through traumatic events in their life, they are more sensitive to the neurodevelopmental toxicity that lead causes. So if you have lead and you have stress, it's worse for you than if you had either one by itself. And I think that is probably applies beyond lead to other types of environmental contaminants also. So I hope that there can be more study on that as well.
Well, I think there needs to be a lot more done on chronic effects, especially with pesticides. I used to work with at DEQ. There's a lot of speculation on what the subacute effects levels were, because when they approved pesticides, they said they do a lot of work before they hit the market, but they're usually doing these 96-hour tests on Daphnia or zebrafish to see how many die in a lab within 96 hours, and then they extrapolate a number to come up with a chronic benchmark. And those benchmarks are very valuable for us to use, but was it based in reality? And a good example is glyphosate, which is Roundup, which is considered pretty safe, and there's a lot of debate around that. But the aquatic life benchmark is really high, which means it's considered to be pretty non-toxic. But there's no consideration for the fact that it's everywhere. And when we do monitoring, when I was with DEQ, and what's happening now is that it's showing up everywhere. So 80% of the time we'd go out and take samples in certain streams, glyphosate would be there at low levels relative to the benchmark. But who studied the effects on fish if they're going through glyphosate all the time at those low levels? So some of these chemicals aren't persistent, but they have the effect of persistence if they keep being replaced. There's so much of it being dosed into the creek. And so what are those effects? And those were hard to answer. Those questions were hard to answer when we were being asked. Right.
Well, while the microphone is down there, Kevin, lot of people in Oregon hear PFAS and then have reached the conclusion that it's not a big deal here in Oregon and Washington. Is it a threat? Should we be as concerned as maybe some of us are?
Well, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that we're in much better shape than other states. That doesn't mean we're in perfect shape, and that doesn't mean we won't find sources that we didn't know about. And we're finding more and more businesses that use them that weren't high on the radar screen at EPA at the beginning. And some of those industries might be in Oregon. Electronics, other kinds of companies that are prominent in Oregon. So more study needs to be done. So we have limited data, and I'll let David speak to this because the drinking water results were pretty positive. So I'll let him talk about that.
Yeah, so Oregon Health Authority did with DEQ did a screening study of about 150, 180 small public water systems looking for PFAS in drinking water, and found mostly low levels, mostly non-detect, some detects, and only I think 5 of the places had levels above the health advisory level that exists now. So that's much better than in other states. We don't have as many sources. We don't have the big military bases that Washington has, or so it may be that that's a good reflection of what the levels are like. However, if the final health advisory levels land where the interim ones are, at those very low, below detection limit levels, then that would mean everywhere has PFAS problems. So.
I just wanted to add one thing, and maybe David could correct me, but the data I've seen is that when measured, it's found in the human population in 95% of the people. So it's in your floss, and it's in your home, and it needs to be labeled. And I don't think it is. But that's not really.
Yeah, there's not any requirement for labeling
right.
in products, and you're correct. All of us have it in our bodies. Yeah.
So another question that, what do you think are the biggest threats to public health? What is it that we should be most concerned about? What should keep us up at night in thinking about toxics? And I'll tell you, we're going to be working on a Northwest Toxic Summit, and this panel is kind of the launch point for that for June. What are the issues that we're not getting at here? How should we go deeper? Elise, jump in.
Yeah, I'll take that one to begin with. So for the compounds that I spoke about, so microplastics, pharmaceuticals, herbicides, and pesticides, there are numerous, a mountain of studies for most of them on effects on organisms. We have very few studies, at least on microplastics, on effects on humans. Studies are coming out demonstrating that they're in human blood, they're in human colon tissue, they're in the lungs, they're in human placentas. So we know they're making their way into the human body. And it seems very naive to assume that when we study these compounds, be it pharmaceuticals in unintended concentrations and in unintended bodies, or microplastics or herbicides, that they have effects on other organisms, including fish, so vertebrates, but that they wouldn't have an effect on us. What's more concerning to me than that is that we really don't understand, again, these interactive effects when we have many compounds in our body. Or when we study multiple stressor effects in organisms, we generally see a more detrimental effect from multiple stressors than from single stressors. It's not always, but generally. And so it seems, again, very naive to think that that wouldn't be the case in human bodies as well. Did I answer your question? Sort of.
Yeah, I would say, so there's a lot of ways to slice this with what's a threat to public health. Narrowing it down to water, I feel like this isn't like a specific chemical, but I think climate change is a big, like probably the major one. I mean, we talk about, I don't know if people remember when the city of Salem had the problem with cyanotoxins in their drinking water. That was a really big deal. And if you have, and you know, that is just, there's nothing special about Salem that, you know, any surface water can have a cyanobacterial bloom on it. And once it's there, you can't really do anything. You just have to wait until it dies. And, you know, and with climate change, we expect more frequent and longer duration blooms because of the conditions will be better for them. And then also related to climate change is water quantity, right? It's bad to have contaminants in your water, but it's also bad not to have water. So you know, having adequate water is like a really critical, immediate need for public health. To worry about anything else, you have to have water first, enough to drink.
That's a very good point. So, do you have something to add, Kevin?
Yeah, in terms of water quantity also, we're seeing higher concentrations of chemicals in the water because there's not as much of it. So, yeah, the loadings might even go down. In some cases, we feel like, David and Jean can chime in here, we feel like we're actually making progress, like on pesticides through the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program, but sometimes it's not showing up because of these dry years. So if we were to look at the total loading of the chemical into the water, it might go down, but the concentrations are going up because there's less water. And that's important because the fish and other organisms are affected by the concentrations, not just the loading. And the other thing about climate change and pesticides is just an example in some of these areas that we're working in and have worked in, you're seeing new pests show up because they're coming from the south. There's a lot of migration, you know, it's within some of these invasive species that now have a warmer climate in Oregon and Washington that would never survive the winters here, right? So the spotted winged Drosophila showed up 10 years ago in the cherry orchards in the Dells. And after all of these pesticide programs that they put in on integrated pest management, farmers are doing a great job, and all of a sudden this fruit fly on steroids shows up that is impervious to those management techniques, and so they have to pull out the chemistry from the 1970s and dose it. So I just want to give that example because if you see different problems, like pest problems that show up because of climate change, you're going to be using more chemical.
And those pests can also be vectors like mosquitoes that bring diseases that we haven't had here before from the south.
Great. So are there any questions out here? I think we're just going to take a couple questions. Anybody but Dale? Oh, Jean.
All right. So, Clean Water Act in 1972 wasn't just more federal funding and that sort of thing. It's a paradigm shift in what the water quality laws were at the time, shifting from having to show there was an adverse impact from a pollutant source before you could implement a control to requiring primary and secondary treatment for wastewater treatment plants, effluent guidelines, and effluent controls for industrial sources. And that resulted in big changes and big improvements in water quality that were affected by point sources. We're slowly getting to non-point sources on conventional pollutants, primarily because it's been state by state and individual rules and no federal requirements on minimum technology, but we're starting to get there. And noticing in Kevin's slide, there's TSCA, Consumer Product Center or Commission, a number of different laws. So it seems like with toxic chemicals, we may be still in the 1970s from a regulatory paradigm. What needs to be the regulatory paradigm for 2023, 2024 for addressing these thousands and thousands of chemicals?
Dianne might have something to add to this, but I would look to the North and the South to get a good example of a framework that I think works really well and time will tell. And that is in Washington and California, they have these safer consumer products laws that basically give them TSCA authority at the state level, but they do it in a lot more streamlined, innovative way. So for instance, in California, they're gonna look at some of the problems that are being caused by tires now. Okay, well, tires produce a lot of zinc, and they're everywhere. All the roadways are having zinc problems in stormwater. Well, it could be coming off of roofs after they were treated for moss, but a lot of it's from tires. And then 6-PBD. And so what California is doing is say, okay, we're gonna regulate tires under the Safer Consumer Products Law. And if we determine that's unreasonable risk, you, the industry, you're gonna have to do an alternatives analysis and find a safer product or a safer chemical substitute. And Washington's doing the same thing, Safer Products for Washington. So the state agencies now have a lot more authority to manage these chemicals in their state that are a problem. And it's looking at the products and saying, what's the product chemical combinations that are really an issue rather than this one chemical at a time kind of business. And that seems to be working. And they're doing a lot of that in Washington right now, where the legislature just said, okay, you have the authority to come up with your list of priorities. We'll check on you, make sure that's okay. But agency, you have a Department of Ecology, Cal EPA, you have a lot of authority now. Prior to that, in Oregon, we banned some flame retardants, like brominated flame retardants, one at a time. The legislature did that. But those are one-offs. That didn't give the DEQ any authority to do anything beyond that. Otherwise, if you don't have the legislature do it, you have to look to EPA. And so those state laws are really innovative.
I'd like to see, as I alluded to earlier, EPA use the authority as given under new TSCA and even extend some of their thinking, like their risk management actions are finally going to come out under 2016 TSCA. And we've talked to them about, why don't you implement extended producer responsibility, take back programs. If an industry wants to put something in a product, you have to be willing to take it back. And we were told by their lawyers they can't do it. But in my reading of the law, I don't see why they can't do things like that. And they're not really, I don't think, thinking enough. Maybe they need to look at these state programs that do implement some of this stuff and extend their thinking on what TSCA can really do.
So I want to ask Jean a question. We've had a lot of talk about toxics and TSCA and even FIFRA, but not a lot about the Clean Water Act. What Clean Water Act programs that you oversee and DEQ can be used to solve some of our problems with toxics in the environment?
Did you say Clean Water Act?
Yeah, or water laws. Really?
Well, there's the obvious ones that we have. I talked about the pesticide stewardship partnerships, and those are certain effectiveness on current use pesticides. But those are kind of outside the Clean Water Act. Certainly, if we have water quality criteria for a toxic chemical, then this is on 303D, thus we do a TMDL and you can reduce it. It's a very long, elaborate process. I also think, though, probably better implementation of our narrative toxic, which is basically no toxic and toxics amounts, so that we don't have to go through the decades-long process of developing water quality criteria. We can use aquatic life benchmarks, human health benchmarks, things like that, to say it's a problem and to identify that as an area that needs to be worked on. And I just wanted to echo what Evan and Dianne said, is that Clean Water Act, state of Oregon, when the Clean Water Act was done in 1972, that was more or less modeled after a lot of work that was done in Oregon in the 1960s with the Willamette Basin under those commissions back then. And I fully believe what you said in Washington's going on right now with toxic chemicals in California. State is microcosms that can then be boiled up or up into the federal process and federal regulations for better, well, not better than the states, but more widespread implementation, I think, is a very effective model of states as proving grounds for that.
Holly, can I add to that?
Yes.
Okay, so we talked early about the Clean Water Act, and when Dana Pasky was talking, and when we've talked a little bit about this today, there's been a recognition recently in the Clean Water Act. It started with the 87 amendments to some extent with the National Estuary Program, Section 320. Chris Hathaway was in the room. He represents one of the 27 national estuaries. But the Columbia River Basin got we got an amendment to the Clean Water Act, Section 123, and it's a shift. It's a paradigm shift away from, okay, we're going to have an NPDES program to we're going to start looking at ecosystems. And, we have a number of these large geographic ecosystems that are part of the Clean Water Act. And as Dan said earlier today, Puget Sound just got named. We used to have a competition. We're in the Clean Water Act, you're not now. We can't say that anymore. So, but I think that, having that ecosystem approach, and then us, given the limitations, we all know the limitations of the Clean Water Act. Well, here we have this gigantic opportunity in the Columbia and also in Puget Sound and also in other big ecosystems around the country to look at, an infusion of money that's coming in and to pay for some of the, to fund education programs so that people can demand that their dental floss is identified as having PFAS in it. Education programs to help with bilingual education or multilingual so that people in different communities have access to information to help them make better decisions. Monitoring, we have 7 monitoring projects in the Columbia, we've got 17 more, that's 20 more monitoring projects. There's going to be PFAS and PBDEs, and the Kootenai tribe's going to be looking at selenium and mercury, and the Nez Perce tribe's going to be looking at methylmercury, and up in Wenatchee they're going to be looking at DDT, which is still a problem. We're going to have a lot of information that's going to be coming in from those monitoring projects, and we have the opportunity to engage people to help them sort of figure out what are we going to do. If we have a problem in a certain area, what are we going to do about it, and how do we direct toxics reduction actions to do that. So I guess I just want to, the Clean Water Act is kind of shifting in a tool to look more at geographic ecosystems, and I think that's something that we all need to think about, and that's something we're going to be talking about at our upcoming toxics summit
In June.
In June.
That was excellent. Amen, sister. So I told you I would get you out of here on time, and I just wanted to say how much I respect Mary Lou and the work that you've done. And I'm sure many of you know Mary Lou is going to be leaving EPA after a stellar career. So thank you for all of your work. So I have just a couple of kind of closing thoughts. One is that we really didn't know what it was going to look like to all be together again. And it feels really remarkably normal, and it feels great. And so thank you all for coming and being our first in-person gathering, solely in-person gathering in 3 years. And I will send you materials and links, and you will all receive it by noon tomorrow. If you don't get it, then email me, because I think I have the wrong email address, because I should be getting that to you. And then once again, we're going to take this conversation and we're going to go a lot deeper in June at a Northwest Toxic Summit. So thank you all so much, and have a nice evening.